New day for recording, new deck to check out. Today's video, we're going to be looking at Spell Mage for Madness at the Darkmoon Faire. Before the video begins, I'd really appreciate it if you guys did drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you do want to see a lot more guides. On the last video for ETC Warrior, I had a comment talking about if I could do a video for Spell Mage, so that's basically what it's going to be. If you want to give me some deck recommendations to check out and try and give you a guide and my personal take on it, feel free to let me know in the comments below. That being said, let's just get on with the video. In this video, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to talk about a consistent win condition for the deck just because of the inherent RNG that applies with this deck, but I plan to talk about what the deck is, the style of how you play it, a better mulligan guide for the deck, and ultimately what I think the deck's position is in the meta and how you can go about playing the deck, dealing with it in-game. So Spell Mage is an archetype that's existed for a while. Madness at the Darkmoon Faire did not really give the deck a ton of new utility specifically for the no minion variant, but they did get a lot of support for powerful cards to help them close the game out, and I want to talk about why that makes the deck a relative contender. In the current meta that we have, Deck of Lunacy has become a powerful card that I would actually put very close to comparing to Prince Keleseth. It's a powerful bomb that when you can drop it as early as you can, the rest of your game plan has now just become that much more efficient. It is, however, a lot more variable, and that is something that needs to be taken into account when analyzing the competitive viability of the deck. With some lists including cards like the Amazing Reno, you'll end up seeing that that doesn't interfere with a lot of the core cards that actually end up being successful to the deck requiring no minions like Font of Power and Apexis Blast. Most of the cards that are in here end up being a burst-oriented style gameplay, but I've found the strongest way to play this deck is actually in a control variant, and I can kind of go into why. The deck has a lot of powerful core mage spells that ultimately result in you being able to consistently clear the board and make sure that your spells do what you need them to do. With the inclusion of cards like Rolling Fireball and Blizzard, there's a very clear late game end where you want to make sure that you are maintaining board priority. And with cards like Font of Power, Learn Draconic, and Power of Creation, those are your key cards in this deck that help to generate minions so that you have a board presence in order to close out a game outside of reserving your burst in the form of Fireball, Frostbolt, and Apexis Blast. Early on, the deck is really good if you can hit Deck of Lunacy early. The lack of consistency in the deck makes me think it wasn't an originally strong, viable deck, but I've ended up finding that Deck of Lunacy is very powerful just because of the sheer amount of mana efficiency you have by playing this deck. With Incanter's Flow reducing 29 to 30 cards of your deck, if you're running the Amazing Reno, it's 29, to reduce the overwhelming majority, if not all of your deck, ends up becoming a very efficient 2-mana card to just help reduce and make your turns more efficient later on. The secret inclusion for the new card Rigged Fair Game helps to give you a little bit of tempo and sustain that card draw. Once again, that is just a little bit tougher now because the meta has been oriented very aggressively with Demon Hunter and Rogue, and a little bit of Shaman starting to run rampant, and because of that, you need to recognize that your objective is to survive. Surviving in the early game is absolutely critical. That's why a lot of lists are running a very low-end curve of spells with Magic Trick, Ray of Frost, Ancient Mysteries to get a Flame Ward out of your deck. The whole point is making sure that you can not take too much damage in the early game, so your late game value with powerful spells help to close that game out. In general, the mulligan for this deck is always wanting a Font of Power, Learn Draconic, Deck of Lunacy, and Incanter's Flow. Your early game needs to be generating minions from Font of Power just because early on you want to develop some board presence. Deck of Lunacy and Incanter's Flow ultimately help to make the rest of your game as efficient as possible, so the earlier you get those, the more likely you are to have success playing it. And Learn Draconic as a card is extremely efficient as a 1-mana 6/6, which in a deck of pure spells is extremely easy to proc. And that is, in core, why the deck has found some success. I recently bumped into a Spell Mage while I was playing Pure Paladin, and my original impression of the deck was going to be that it didn't feel strong because you didn't have a lot of great control tools or value generating tools towards the end of the game. Granted, I think this may have been due to some RNG, but at the same time, I can't discredit it. The Font of Power being able to hit an Archmage Antonidas immediately created a whole new level of burst pressure that I needed to play around. Combining that with the fact that he generated Mana Cyclone and Khadgar with a Conjurer's Calling, there's a lot of different spell packages you can orient in this deck in order to make it successful. I'm currently looking at the Spell Mage list from APX Void, Apoxa Void. I'm gonna keep messing these names up. Tempostorm's Meta Snapshot list from December 1st. I'm currently looking at this December 4th. His list chooses to not run anything that seems very control-y at its core. When I first tried to iterate this deck, used Flame Strike and a couple other big spells like Mask of Cthulhu, but he ends up creating a list around Power of Creation and the previous big spells I've mentioned, Blizzard, Rolling Fireball, Apexis Blast, Fireball, and then a lot of secrets and other stuff to help you transition from that early mid-game to late-game bombs. Not to mention, with Deck of Lunacy, those spells now become extremely relevant, and with Incanter's Flow reducing the cost either before or after Deck of Lunacy will also change the types of spells you will be receiving. It's important to note that a lot of the secrets in your deck will probably become irrelevant once Deck of Lunacy is played, because you don't have any 0-cost spells or lower to become a 1, 2, or 3-cost secret. So it's important to know that your Ancient Mysteries, if in hand, should be played prior to playing Deck of Lunacy, otherwise they will be dead draws. But the average mage minion just turns out to be very powerful, and when you always force your resources to be used in a control manner, they end up becoming much more efficient, which is why I think the deck has some level of viability to it. I think the deck has strong merit from having very efficient cards turn after turn, but the issue starts to fall in there is no consistent win condition in the control deck. And that leads me to another big point. Cthulhu the Shattered is a minion that you can run in Spell Mage, because at the start of game, he blows up into the 4 pieces of Cthulhu. Those are all spells, so your Font of Power and your Apexis Blast are still active with Cthulhu in your deck. The big issue is there is some anti-synergy between running your Cthulhu pieces and Deck of Lunacy, because if you play Deck of Lunacy with any Cthulhu pieces in your deck, you have completely nullified the opportunity of finishing a game with Cthulhu. That being said, if you end up in a game where you know Cthulhu is not going to be played, presumably against the Demon Hunter or the Rogue, Deck of Lunacy is now just going to give you 4 8-mana spells for 5 mana with the Cthulhu pieces. And that's pretty darn efficient. Likewise, against a warrior matchup where you might need to actually end up playing Cthulhu as your win condition, otherwise they're just gonna out-tank and out-fatigue you, then you just don't play Deck of Lunacy, and now you're working with Cthulhu pieces that will ultimately help to build in the final punch of Cthulhu the Shattered dealing 30 damage. And the Tempostorm list is choosing to not run the Amazing Reno. I don't think that's necessarily bad. I will say, however, that the Reno just provides a good chunk of tempo and value as a card on its own. It is also a guaranteed board clear as a battle cry, and it doesn't interfere with the rest of your deck. I think that card probably should make an inclusion in this list. There is going to end up being a lot of dead cards in the set, but with Rattlegore running rampant and this list not choosing to hard run Polymorph, I think the Amazing Reno is a perfect answer to handle the Rattlegore spam that Warrior can provide. With Res Priest going crazy with cards like Idol of Yasharaj and Blood of Gahun and all those crazy pieces, you're gonna end up having to remove a big board. Not to mention Druids trying to do whatever they want with clowns. The point being, Reno is your one card for a big reset button. We messed up, we need to reset. And in those slower matchups, I feel like that card is almost core to your success, because without it, the deck does not consistently have a way to deal with tall and wide boards, which are starting to become more relevant in this meta. The early tools to stall your opponent's aggression, I think, are really good, but at the same time, when we have control lists like Warrior right now that are not only maintaining that board, but also developing armor, having a more consistent win condition, it makes me feel like Spell Mage is a list that truthfully is probably going to fall off in the expansion. The support that they got with Deck of Lunacy was nothing bad. To be brutally honest, I think the card has a lot of potential, but the lack of consistency, regardless of it being a high roll potential, makes me think that it's not something you want to have competitively in terms of just viability. I've tried looking at the deck and I've played it a little bit more. What I ended up finding was my control tools are most often there, and I'm usually able to manage the game. Against a slower deck, I don't have the value that they have as often or as consistently as I'd really like it to be. I've found that Druid with Ysera Unleashed, that amount of dragon pressure and that minion alone kind of amount to like 2 or 3 of the different minions I'm trying to drop and contest in the form of Power of Creation and Font of Power. And when I think of other decks that are slow and just greedier than the Spell Mage, and a control style deck like Warrior that can just handle early aggression better, Spell Mage is just trying to do the best of both worlds in, unfortunately, just a suboptimal way, in my personal opinion. That being said, there's not a whole lot more to really talk about the deck because a lot of it just becomes so random and on a game-by-game basis. That's why I initially proposed the Mulligan Guide and said that like Font of Power, Learn Draconic, Deck of Lunacy, and Cantor's Flow are all really good. But outside of that, you're on a game-by-game basis. So when you queue up and you see your opponents playing a Spell Mage, what exactly are you trying to do against your opponent? It really depends on the deck that you're playing, but ultimately what I found to be the strongest core of how to play the deck is early aggression. If you have any form of a deck that can play relatively aggressively, apply the pressure that you can, because Spell Mage has a finite number of resources compared to a lot of other decks in terms of control. So you want to aggress, pressure them, make it difficult for them to try and play their efficient game plan. If you are a slower deck, like ETC Warrior, your Highlander Priest, all that fun stuff, you can take it as slow as you want. A lot of their core is about surviving the early game, which means that a good chunk of their core set is relatively weak compared to the big stuff that other decks are trying to do, like in Priest and Druid. So when you take some of that core archetype of how they need to survive the early game, and recognize that those tools, even with Deck of Lunacy, are going to become 4 to 6 cost spells, while impactful, probably aren't going to close the game out in a very powerful way that you think. Granted, I've had some success with the deck playing it and using my Fireballs and Apexis Blast and Frostbolt for burst to close the game out, because eventually you just get to a point where you just full send it. You gotta close the game out, right? You need to recognize with a lot of different decks, and I think this one is also very important to recognize, the difference between controlling the board and understanding what resources are left in your deck so you know when to pivot to your win condition of bursting your opponent down. I've found personally when I play Hunter, I have the strong tendency of trying to just keep clearing a board, making sure my board presence is really there. But at some point, you have to look at your deck and say, okay, I have 2 Fireballs and a Frostbolt left. My opponent's at like 24 health. So if I really need to kill him here, I can't use these Fireballs to control his board. If you're about to die, scrap that. Clear the board. Hopefully you'll figure it out at some point. But understand that your win condition is early minions from Font of Power and Learn Draconic, Power of Creation as a hyper-efficient card, and closing out the game with Burst. If at any point you need to deviate from that game plan, it should be either to control your opponent's early game aggression, or to slow the pace down to try and squeeze out as much value as you can in the deck to deal with slower control or value-oriented decks. That'll wrap up the video. Once again, I do stream live on Twitch, and I have a Discord community where we do chit-chat about Hearthstone. I'll link both of those in the description below. Let me know in the comments what you guys think of another deck to play. Leave a like, and subscribe if you are interested to check out a few more Hearthstone guides that I'll be publishing. Until next time, guys, take care. Peace.